Tonight, beneath a sky washed in moonlight, Midnight Cat waits on the branch of an old coastal tree. His black fur is almost indistinguishable from the darkness, except where the silver light touches the curve of his back and the small crescent upon his forehead. Far below him, the sea moves with a patient rhythm, carrying the faint scent of salt and rain across the sleeping shore. He watches the horizon for a moment, then turns his bright blue eyes toward us. History has preserved certain facts about Edward Teach, the sailor remembered as Blackbeard. It has recorded the name of his ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, and the fear his appearance inspired. Yet around those facts grew countless tales, repeated in harbors and beside lanterns long after the men who first told them were gone. Tonight's journey belongs to that quieter realm of legend, a story sailors might have shared when the lamps were low, the watch was long, and the ocean beyond the hull seemed to contain every secret in the world. In the early 18th century, the Caribbean was a world joined by water and divided by uncertain lines. Islands belonging to rival crowns stood within a few days' sail of one another. Merchant vessels carried sugar, timber, cloth, tools, letters, and news between harbors, while naval patrols searched the same passages for smugglers and pirates. Charts were copied by hand, coastlines were sometimes drawn from memory, and blank spaces still appeared between known routes. Sailors learned to trust more than ink. They watched the color of the water, the flight of birds, the direction of drifting plants, and the shape of clouds above unseen land. In such a world, a faded map could be both invitation and danger. A captain who followed one needed judgment, good fortune, and a crew willing to continue after familiar shores had disappeared. The Caribbean Sea lay open beneath the stars, dark and polished, as though an immense sheet of black glass had been placed between the islands. Across that surface moved a three-masted ship. Queen Anne's Revenge carried her black sails high against the night, but there was little wind to fill them. The canvas breathed rather than strained, drawing in the warm air and releasing it again with a faint rustle. Water gathered at the bow in two narrow ribbons, and slipped along the oak sides with a hush that never quite broke the stillness. From a distance, the ship might have seemed abandoned, a shadow moving without crew or command. Only the glow of a shaded lantern near the stern revealed that someone remained awake. Edward Teach stood on the quarterdeck with both hands resting upon the rail. He was a large man, made broader by his dark coat and the heavy fall of his beard. In noisy ports, men spoke of that beard with unease, describing the ribbons and slow-burning cords he sometimes wore within it to make himself appear less like a sailor and more like something that had risen from the sea. Here, however, there was no audience to frighten. The cords were packed away, his pistols remained in his cabin, and the night wind moved freely through the black hair upon his shoulders. He listened to the ship as another man might listen to rain upon a roof. Each creak told him where the timbers carried weight. Each tremor in the rail spoke of water passing beneath the rudder. Nothing in those sounds suggested danger. Upon the chart table behind him lay an old sheet of parchment, held flat by a brass compass, a coil of line, and a smooth stone taken from some distant beach. The map showed familiar islands in faded brown ink. Beyond them, where ordinary charts offered only empty water, a narrow course had been drawn toward an unnamed quay. At its center, beneath the sketch of a hill, someone had marked a small circle. There was no painted skull, no dramatic warning, and no promise written in a king's ransom. only a set of careful bearings and 3 words in an unfamiliar hand, beneath the white stone. Teach had carried the map for many months. He did not know who had drawn it, but the measurements were the work of someone who understood tides, reefs, and the movement of stars. That was enough to make him follow. He had first seen the parchment in the back room of a harbor tavern, where an aging pilot offered it in exchange for passage away from men to whom he owed money. The pilot had not claimed to have visited the island. He said the map had belonged to a navigator who died during a fever season, leaving behind a sea chest filled with instruments, damp papers, and one carefully wrapped key. Teach had examined the bearings before accepting. Several matched reefs and channels he already knew, including details omitted from official charts. Whoever had drawn the route had sailed at least part of it. The old pilot received his passage and a place among the crew until the next friendly port. The map, meanwhile, remained with Teach, waiting until the season, weather, and temper of the sea made an attempt possible. The crew knew that their captain was searching for something, though he had not filled their heads with tales of limitless gold. He had simply told them that an island waited beyond the usual sailing routes, and that, if the map proved true, every man aboard would receive his fair share. Under the articles they had signed, such matters were not left to whim. Shares were counted, duties were named, and even a captain was bound by agreements made before the mast. The promise of treasure pleased the men, but on that quiet night it did not make them restless. They had sailed long enough to understand that the sea rewarded patience more often than excitement. Across the deck, the watch attended to small tasks. A sailor near the mainmast examined a length of rope, passing it through his hands and feeling for broken fibers. Another checked the lashings around a boat suspended above the water. Near the bow, a younger man leaned over the rail and watched pale sparks appear in the wake. Tiny creatures in the sea glowed whenever the hull disturbed them, then faded into darkness a few seconds later. None of the men shouted. Orders were given in low voices. Footsteps fell lightly upon the planks, and the ship continued westward beneath the constellations. Near the galley, the final meal of the evening had already been cleared away. Tin cups hung upside down from hooks, and the smell of pepper, smoke, and boiled grain lingered in the warm air. A sailor carried the sand glass to the quarterdeck and turned it when the bell marked the watch. Fine grains began their measured descent. Time aboard ship did not pass by clocks in every room. It passed through bells, changes of duty, the angle of stars, and the repeated work needed to keep wood and canvas moving across water. One group rested while another watched. The helmsman surrendered the steering to the man relieving him and quietly reported the heading. Such exchanges prevented the night from becoming shapeless. They divided the ocean into manageable portions, each watched over by someone whose turn would eventually end. Teach looked up. The stars had guided sailors long before any of them had learned to mark a course on paper. Tonight they seemed unusually clear. The Milky Way crossed the sky like a trail of dust, and the North Star remained steady above the dark line of the sea. The captain compared it with the compass, then examined the faint ripple of current along the hull. Their course was true. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the hidden island waited. It had waited through storms, wars, and the passing of ships whose names had disappeared from memory. It could wait one more night. For a time, nothing changed. The sails drew softly, the wake shone and vanished, and the lantern beside the helm swayed within its glass. Then the air grew warmer. The breeze that had traveled steadily from the east weakened until the canvas began to hang loose from the yards. A smell of wet stone and distant rain reached the quarterdeck. Teach turned toward the southern sky, where several stars had already disappeared. A dark bank of cloud was rising from the horizon, broad and unbroken. It did not hurry, but it covered more of the sky each time he looked. The boatswain came aft before he was called. He was an older sailor with silver at his temples and a habit of studying the clouds as carefully as other men studied charts. "It will be upon us before the next glass," he said. Teach nodded. The order passed quietly through the ship. The upper sails were taken in, the remaining canvas shortened, and every loose object on deck was carried below or secured with line. Gun crews checked the lashings that held the heavy cannon against the ship's sides. Hatches were covered but not sealed, allowing air to move through the lower decks. At the pumps, 2 men tested the handles and listened for the clean pull of water. Nothing was done in panic. Each sailor knew his place, and each familiar action made the ship feel more prepared. The first rain arrived as separate drops, broad and cool against sun-warmed wood. They left dark circles upon the deck and gathered along the rail. Then came more, until the circles joined and the planks shone beneath the lanterns. The wind returned from a new direction. It pressed against the shortened sails, heeling the ship only slightly before the helmsman brought her bow into a safer angle. Above them, the rigging began to sing, a low tone passing through rope, mast, and canvas. Thunder answered from beyond the clouds, deep enough to be felt through the soles of their feet. Below deck, the off-watch crew settled into the secure spaces between the guns. Hammocks swung in shallow arcs from the overhead beams. A lamp burned inside a metal guard, throwing amber light across folded coats, sea chests, and faces marked by salt and sun. The men heard the weather gathering around them, yet the sounds reached them through several layers of oak. Rain became a steady murmur. Thunder lost its sharp edge and rolled away like a cart crossing a distant bridge. One sailor repaired a torn cuff by lamplight. Another carved a small bird from a scrap of wood, turning it after every careful stroke of his knife. A cook secured the lid of an iron pot and wedged it where it could not slide. The ordinary nature of these actions was reassuring. Storms were part of life at sea, and this one would pass as others had. Teach descended for only a few minutes. He moved among the gun deck, checking the cannon breechings and speaking briefly with the men stationed at the pumps. No water was entering beyond the normal seepage of an old wooden hull. The carpenter reported that the masts were sound. Satisfied, Teach paused beside the hammocks. "Those who are not on watch should rest," he said. "The ship has work to do, and so do we. Let her carry the weather while you keep your strength for morning." The words were simple, without promises that the sea could never keep. Even so, shoulders lowered and hands loosened. The men trusted the ship because they had prepared her, and they trusted one another because every rope and fastening had been checked together. Back on the quarterdeck, rain covered the ocean in a moving veil. The horizon was gone. Water streamed from the brim of Teach's hat and gathered in his beard, but his eyes remained on the compass, the helmsman, and the dark shape of the mainsail. The storm lifted Queen Anne's Revenge upon long waves and lowered her into the hollows between them. At the top of each rise, the ship seemed to pause beneath the clouds. Then the bow descended, parting the black water and sending white foam outward along both sides. The motion was powerful but regular. Once its rhythm became familiar, it felt less like falling and more like breathing. The worst of the weather arrived near midnight. Wind pressed hard against the rigging, and the rain grew so dense that lantern light reached only a few paces. Orders had to be repeated, but no one needed to run. Men moved along lifelines stretched across the deck, keeping one hand on the rope and one free for their work. The helmsman held the ship at a steady angle to the waves. At the bow, two sailors watched for floating timber or the pale break of water above a hidden reef. Teach remained beside them, not because he believed himself stronger than the storm, but because a captain's calm was useful when others were tired. During one long rise, a loose length of line began striking the mast. The sound was small compared with the wind, yet the boatswain heard it at once. He and another sailor crossed the deck, secured the line, and checked the knot twice before returning. Later, a barrel shifted beneath the forward hatch. Men below wedged it firmly between others and reported the movement to the quarterdeck. These were not grand acts, but ships survived storms through hundreds of such corrections. A rope tightened before it parted. A hatch covered before water entered. A tired helmsman relieved before his judgment weakened. Queen Anne's Revenge endured because attention moved through her from bow to stern, carried by every member of the crew. Gradually, the spaces between the thunder grew longer. The rain softened from a hard drumming into a fine hiss across the sea. Wind still moved through the sails, but it no longer struck in sudden blows. One by one, the men who had served through the height of the storm were relieved. They descended to the warmth below deck, removed their wet coats, and climbed into hammocks that began to swing with the easier movement of the ship. Those coming on watch stepped into the washed night and found the air cooler than before. By the final hours before dawn, only a light rain remained. The sea after a storm has its own kind of silence. It is not the untouched silence of calm weather, but the quiet that follows great effort. Queen Anne's Revenge moved beneath low clouds while water dripped from every yard and line. The deck had been rinsed clean. Salt, dust, and the small marks of many working feet had flowed through the scuppers and disappeared. Teach stood beneath the awning near the chart table, where the map remained dry. Their course had shifted during the storm, though not by much. He measured the distance, corrected the heading, and ordered a little more sail set as the wind settled behind them. At dawn, fog rose from the warm water. It spread first in narrow bands, then joined into a white field that hid the sky and sea alike. The world around the ship contracted until the bow seemed to enter empty air. Sound behaved differently there. The splash of water against the hull appeared close enough to touch, while a voice from the forecastle reached the quarterdeck muted and round. The lead line was made ready, and a sailor at the bow called the depth at measured intervals. Another kept the ship's bell near at hand. Their speed was reduced, the sails trimmed, and every eye turned toward the pale wall ahead. For almost an hour, nothing emerged from the fog. Then the lookout lifted one hand. Somewhere off the port bow came the faint knock of wood against wood, followed by the creak of blocks under strain. It was not an echo from their own ship. Teach listened until he could separate the sounds. Canvas drawing, water divided by a second hull, and the occasional murmur of men trying to remain quiet. Another vessel was moving through the mist, close enough that its wake would soon cross theirs. The first thing they saw was the tip of a mast. It appeared as a gray mark above the fog, vanished, and returned farther to the west. Beneath it came the shadow of sails and the dark outline of a high-sided ship. No flag could yet be seen, but the careful approach and the closed gun ports told Teach enough. Merchant captains did not usually hunt through fog. This vessel had altered course to follow them, perhaps after receiving news in the last port that Queen Anne's Revenge had sailed west. Teach did not order the guns run out. His first command was to change course by a few points and allow the fog to hide them again. Sailors moved to the braces. Canvas shifted overhead with a controlled rustle, and the bow turned toward deeper water. For several minutes it seemed the maneuver had worked. The other ship faded until only the faint complaint of its rigging remained. Then a bell rang once within the mist. A moment later came the unmistakable sound of sails being reset. The pursuer had guessed their turn. The crew prepared without noise. Gun ports were opened on the side facing the distant shadow, but the cannon remained secured until they were needed. Powder charges were brought up in covered containers. Alongside the ordinary round shot, the gunners placed chain shot intended for rigging rather than hulls. Teach's purpose was not to sink a ship in water where neither crew could see the reefs. He wanted only enough distance to continue the voyage. He walked the gun deck once, reminding each captain of his target. "Masts and canvas," he said. "Nothing below the rail unless they give us no choice." The pursuing ship appeared again, much closer now. Its bow emerged from the whiteness, followed by the forward mast and several figures at the rail. A flag rose through the mist. The cloth was damp and difficult to read, but the colors marked a vessel serving the crown. Someone aboard called for Queen Anne's Revenge to shorten sail. The order crossed the water strangely, losing words as it traveled. Teach waited. He had built much of his fearful reputation upon knowing when not to begin a battle. If the sight of him, his ship, and the waiting gun ports could end the encounter, no powder needed to burn. But the other captain held his course. A flash opened briefly along the enemy bow. The shot crossed high above Queen Anne's Revenge and disappeared into the fog. The report came afterward, heavy and sudden, then rolled away over the water. Teach raised his hand. His gunners touched slow matches to the prepared pieces. The reply was not a full broadside, only 3 measured shots. Flame lit the white air, smoke joined the mist, and the recoil drew the cannon back against their ropes. Far ahead came the snap of damaged rigging. A dark spar tilted across the pale outline of the pursuing ship, carrying a sail with it. The sail descended slowly, tangled in lines and covering part of the forward deck. The gun crews reloaded, but Teach did not order them to fire again. Through the fog came hurried movement as the other crew worked to clear the fallen gear. Their vessel had lost speed but remained afloat and upright. No cries for help followed, only the hard labor of sailors protecting their ship. Teach watched until the distance began to widen. Then the gun ports were closed, the powder returned below, and the canvas above Queen Anne's Revenge drew full once more. The encounter had lasted only a few minutes. Soon even the pursuer's bell could no longer be heard. Only after the fog concealed them did the crew inspect their own ship. The enemy's warning shot had crossed high, but a falling fragment had cut a small tear near the edge of one sail. 2 sailors climbed aloft with a patch of canvas and a palm and needle. Below, the gun crews swabbed the 3 cannon, cleaned away spilled powder, and secured each piece against the hull. The sharp smell of smoke faded, as damp air moved through the ports. Teach ordered an extra lookout at the stern until they were certain the other vessel had not repaired its rigging quickly enough to follow. Within half an hour, the deck looked much as it had before the encounter. The brief violence left no triumph behind, only relief that the damage on both ships had stopped where it did. The fog held them for the rest of the morning. It made the ocean seem endless, yet the water itself offered small signs of approaching land. A green leaf drifted past the bow, fresh enough that it could not have traveled far. Later came a twig bearing 2 pale blossoms. Birds appeared overhead, their wings briefly visible before the white air concealed them. The depth beneath the keel changed little by little. Teach compared each, sounding with the numbers written beside the final lines on the map. The unknown cartographer had been exact. Near evening, the fog thinned. Light entered it from the west, first pearl gray and then the color of warm honey. The veil lifted from the sea in loose strands, revealing a low island directly ahead. A crescent of white sand enclosed a quiet bay. Behind it rose a green hill covered with palms and broad-leaved trees, while a ridge of pale rock showed through the forest near the summit. No houses or cultivated fields interrupted the shoreline. No smoke rose above the trees. The quay seemed to have been waiting outside ordinary time. As the view cleared, more details appeared. A line of reef curved around the bay like a pale arm beneath the surface. Waves broke quietly upon its outer edge, while the water inside remained smooth. Dark shapes of rays moved over the sand below, broad wings traveling without visible effort. Along the beach, driftwood lay among shells and fallen palm fronds, but there were no boats, footprints, or cut trees. The ridge above matched the final drawing on the map. 2 low shoulders with a narrow white face between them. Teach compared the angle of the evening sun with the marked bearing. For the first time since leaving the known routes, every sign agreed. They had not merely found an island. They had found the island intended by the navigator. Queen Anne's Revenge approached under reduced sail. A boat sounded the entrance to the bay before the larger ship followed. Coral shone beneath the clear water, close enough to see but safely below the keel. When they reached the anchorage, the sails were furled, and the anchor lowered by hand. Chain passed through the hawse-hole with a deep, measured rattle. The flukes caught in sand. The ship turned gently with the evening breeze, and at last the deck became still. Teach ordered an anchor watch to remain posted, and the boat made ready. No matter how peaceful the island appeared, a good captain did not leave his ship without eyes upon the sea. 4 men went ashore with him: the boatswain, the carpenter, an experienced gunner, and a young sailor who could climb quickly if the path became steep. They carried 2 shaded lanterns, a coil of rope, a shovel, fresh water, and the old map inside an oilskin cover. Their oars entered the bay together. Each stroke left a widening oval upon the surface, and droplets fell from the blades like small beads of glass. Behind them, Queen Anne's Revenge rested against a sky turning from amber to violet. Her masts rose in dark, straight lines, familiar and reassuring. The boat touched sand with a quiet scrape. Warm grains shifted beneath the Teach's boots as he stepped ashore. Small waves reached the beach, spread into a thin, clear sheet, and withdrew without hurry. The men pulled the boat beyond the wet line and secured it to a tree root. For a moment they remained beside it, listening. The forest held many sounds, but none suggested human movement. Leaves turning in the breeze, insects beginning their evening song, and water falling somewhere among the rocks. Beyond those sounds lay the distant breath of the sea. The map directed them toward the northern end of the beach, where 3 palms grew from a single mound. Behind those trees, a narrow path entered the forest. It was so faint that they might have missed it without the drawing. Ferns leaned across it, and roots had lifted portions of the soil, yet stones beneath the leaves formed an old line of steps. Someone had once traveled this way often enough to mark a road. Time had softened the work, covering the edges with moss and returning most of it to the island. They climbed as daylight faded. Teach set an unhurried pace, stopping where the ground was steep and allowing each man to find secure footing. The lanterns were not yet needed. The last light filtered through the canopy in green and gold fragments, touching tree trunks, vines, and pools of rainwater left by the storm. The air smelled of damp earth and crushed leaves. Every few minutes the men could look through an opening in the trees and see the ship below, small but distinct in the bay. At the base of the pale ridge, the path divided around a great stone covered in white lichen. Teach unfolded the map. Beneath the white stone, the message had said. The phrase did not refer to the treasure itself, but to the entrance that guarded it. The carpenter examined the rock face and found several vines growing across a narrow recess. When he moved them aside, cooler air touched their hands. Behind the leaves stood a low opening, wide enough for a man to enter without crawling. Along one edge, almost hidden beneath moss, were marks left by an iron tool. The first lantern was lit. Its flame grew within the glass and cast a small circle of amber into the passage. The cave descended gradually, its floor covered in dry sand. Outside, the evening forest remained close for several steps, but its sounds soon weakened. The men heard only their breathing, the brush of boots, and an occasional drop of water falling farther ahead. Stone surrounded them on every side, not threatening but solid, cool, and ancient. Teach ran one hand along the wall. The surface was smooth in places where underground water had passed for centuries. The passage opened into a chamber higher than the light could reach. Stalactites hung from the ceiling in pale rows, and a clear pool occupied one side of the floor. Each drop that fell into it made a single bright note. Ripples traveled outward, touched the dark edge, and disappeared. The men paused without being told. After the storm, the fog, and the brief violence of the chase, the cave offered a different scale of time. Water had shaped it through countless quiet years. Their arrival was only one small moment in a story much older than ships. On the far side of the chamber stood the white stone shown on the map. It was not bright white, but pale limestone rising from darker rock. At its base, beneath a shallow shelf, the sand appeared flatter than elsewhere. The carpenter pressed the blade of the shovel into it. The sand gave easily. A few inches below the surface, metal answered with a dull sound. No one cheered. The noise would have seemed out of place beneath that ceiling. They exchanged glances, then worked together, removing the sand and placing it in a careful mound. The chest emerged gradually. It was smaller than the great treasure boxes painted on the tavern signs, but 4 men would still have struggled to carry it along the forest path. Dark wood showed between iron bands marked by age. The lock had been protected beneath a fold of oiled cloth that had hardened over time. Teach knelt and cleared the final sand from its base. Around the keyhole, the metal had been shaped into the head of a sea creature, its worn eyes gazing outward. From beneath his shirt, Teach drew the silver key that had accompanied the map. It fitted the lock without force. He turned it once. The mechanism resisted, then released with a deep click that traveled around the chamber and returned as a softened echo. He waited until the sound was gone before lifting the lid. Old hinges moved slowly. The smell that rose from inside was not decay, but dry wood, metal, and the faint trace of spices once packed nearby. The lantern revealed rows of coins darkened to the color of warm amber. There were Spanish pieces of 8, gold doubloons, small bars stamped with marks from the ports across the Atlantic, and several strings of pearls wrapped in cloth. A silver cup lay on its side beside a narrow box of rings and stones. None of it flashed with the harsh brilliance of newly polished metal. Time had given every object a muted surface. The treasure seemed less like sudden wealth than a collection of long journeys brought to rest in one sheltered place. Beneath the jewelry lay a packet wrapped in waxed cloth. Teach opened only the outer fold and found several pages covered in the same narrow handwriting as the map. The first lines were a list rather than a confession. Weights of silver, numbers of coins, dates, and names of ports. Lower on the page, the writing changed. The unknown navigator explained that the chest had been assembled over many years by several partners who feared losing everything during a season of war. They hid it on the quay, intending to return when the sea lanes became safe. Some did not survive. Others scattered so widely that no single man could recover it alone. The final writer preserved the route and key, trusting that one day a capable crew would find what time had left behind. There was no curse and no claim of royal ownership, only an unfinished account waiting for its last entry. The boatswain let out the breath he had been holding. The young sailor smiled, though he did not reach into the chest. Under the ship's articles, no man was to take from a prize before it had been counted. Teach respected that rule now as he expected others to respect it later. He lifted only one coin, turning it between his fingers so that the worn image caught the lantern light. Then he returned it to the same place. For months, the map had been an unfinished thought. It had waited on tables in loud taverns, beneath Teach's coat during rain, and inside his cabin while the ship crossed uncertain water. Now the question had an answer. The treasure was real. Yet there was no need to drag it through the forest at night or risk damaging it on the descent. The island had protected the chest for years. It could protect it until morning, when the full crew could make a safe path and carry the contents under agreed watch. Teach closed the lid and turned the key. The men replaced enough sand to conceal the chest from anyone entering by accident, though they left their own work easy to recognize. The carpenter marked the wall with a small sign known only to the crew. Before they departed, each man filled his cup from the water they had brought rather than disturbing the clear pool. The cave remained almost exactly as they had found it. The limestone pale in the lantern glow, the surface of the pool unbroken, and the slow drops continuing their patient measure. Outside, night had settled over the island. The air felt warm after the cool passage, and the forest carried the clean scent of rain. Their lanterns shone upon the old path, revealing root and stones one at a time. There was no reason to hurry. They descended carefully, the treasure no longer an uncertainty pulling them forward. Through the trees, the ship's anchor light glowed in the bay. It appeared, vanished behind leaves, and returned again, always a little closer. On the beach, the tide had risen. Small waves now reached the lower end of the boat, lifting it gently before setting it back on the sand. The men pushed the bow into deeper water and climbed aboard. As they rowed, the island behind them became a single dark shape beneath the stars. Ahead, Queen Anne's Revenge seemed larger with every stroke. Voices reached them from the deck, quiet but eager. The anchor watch had seen their lanterns coming down the hill and knew that the search had not failed. Teach climbed the side and stepped onto familiar oak. He showed the silver coin to the quartermaster, who examined it beneath the lantern and then held it where the nearest sailors could see. A low murmur traveled across the deck. There was satisfaction in it, but no disorder. The chest would be brought aboard in daylight, inventoried openly, and divided according to the articles. For tonight, there was warm food, dry clothing, and the knowledge that the voyage had achieved its purpose. The cook served a simple meal from the pot secured during the storm. Bowls passed from hand to hand. Men ate beneath the open sky, sitting on coils of rope or against the bulwarks. The day's events were retold in short pieces. The sound of the enemy's rigging in the fog, the first bird above the hidden quay, the old steps beneath the ferns, the click of the key inside the cave. No one needed to exaggerate. The truth of what they had seen was strange and satisfying enough. The quartermaster listened before explaining how the recovery would proceed. At first light, a larger party would widen the path only where necessary, leaving the forest otherwise untouched. The chest would be emptied into smaller locked boxes so that no one carried a dangerous weight down the hill. 2 men would record each item at the cave, and 2 more would repeat the count on deck. The shares would be calculated only after the ship reached secure water. These practical details did not lessen the wonder of the discovery. They transformed wonder into something the crew could trust. Every sailor knew that his portion would not disappear behind a cabin door or change according to a captain's mood. When the meal was finished, the watches were set. 2 men remained at the bow, one near the quarterdeck and another below beside the anchor cable. The rest of the crew went to their hammocks. Wet coats hung where air could reach them. The last bowls were washed and nested together. Gun tools were returned to their racks, powder secured, and lantern flames lowered behind glass. Order settled over the ship, one small action at a time. Teach entered his cabin carrying the map, the key, and the single coin. The storm had left the stern windows clean. Through them he could see the island reflected in the bay, its black ridge resting beneath the stars. He placed the coin upon the chart table, not as private treasure but as proof for the morning inventory. Beside it he laid the map and wrote a brief entry in the ship's log. Land sighted after fog, safe anchorage, chest found beneath limestone ridge, recovery at first light. The words occupied only a few lines. A difficult journey often became surprisingly small when placed upon paper. He extinguished all but one candle. Without the movement of open water, the cabin felt remarkably still. The ship turned a fraction around her anchor, and pale reflections from the bay traveled across the ceiling. Teach removed his heavy coat, loosened the cloth at his throat, and sat at the edge of the bunk. Only then did he recognize the full weight of tiredness in his shoulders and hands. It was not unpleasant. It was the honest fatigue that follows work completed and danger past. Across the lower deck, hammocks moved in slow unison. The hull rose only slightly upon the sheltered water, yet that small motion was enough to set the ropes swaying. Breathing deepened around the compartment. Somewhere near the carpenter's chest, a block tapped against the wall until a sleepy sailor reached out and steadied it. After that, the remaining sounds were simple. Water beside the hull, timber settling under its own weight, and the distant steps of the watch above. The men on deck did not sleep, but their duty was peaceful. One watched the dark entrance to the bay. Another looked toward the shore, where nothing moved beyond the palms. At regular intervals they walked the deck, checked the anchor line, and exchanged a few quiet words. The stars turned gradually above the masts. The sea breeze carried the fragrance of wet leaves from the island and the cooler smell of open water from beyond the reef. Safety did not come from pretending that no danger existed. It came from knowing that someone remained awake, that the anchor held, and that every man could rest because another kept watch. Beneath Queen Anne's Revenge, the bay continued its hidden life. Moonlight passed through the clear surface in wavering columns. Small fish moved among coral branches, their silver sides appearing and disappearing as they turned. Seagrass bowed with the current and rose again. The anchor chain descended into blue darkness until it reached the sand, where the heavy flukes remained buried. Around them, tiny shells lay undisturbed. Nothing below knew the names of captains or kings. The sea accepted wood, iron, fish, and stone into the same patient rhythm. Farther down, where the moonlight became faint, the storm could no longer be heard at all. Water carried only a low vibration from the ship's hull and the distant break of waves upon the outer reef. It was the oldest lullaby in the world, a sound without melody and without end. It traveled upward through the keel, across the deck beams, and into the hammocks where the crew slept. Each man heard it without waking. In his cabin, Teach lay beneath a light blanket. The candle beside the bunk shortened, and the flame became smaller within its glass. His thoughts returned briefly to the cave. He saw the pale stone, the still pool, and the chest resting beneath the sand. Yet the gold itself did not remain in his mind. What stayed with him was the click of the lock and the silence that followed, the clear instant when a long uncertainty had ended. He breathed out, and the muscles of his face relaxed. For much of his life, other men had attempted to decide what he was before he spoke. Sailor, criminal, monster, captain, or warning. Teach had learned that fear could be used like a sail, filled and directed so that fewer battles became necessary. Yet reputation had its own weight. It entered a room before him and lingered after he left. On this island, surrounded by men who had worked beside him through wind and fog, that weight felt distant. The sea did not know his reputation. Stone did not tremble at his name. The sleeping ship required only that he keep his agreements, read the weather, and bring the crew home. Those were responsibilities heavy enough, but they were honest ones. The final candle went dark. Starlight remained in the windows, faint but sufficient to outline the desk, the compass, and the folded map. Outside, the anchor watch crossed the quarterdeck and paused near the rail. Inside, the captain's breathing joined the quieter rhythm of the ship. Queen Anne's Revenge rested in the bay, protected by reef, island, and attentive hands. The treasure waited in stone until morning. Nothing else was required of the night. Before dawn, a thin gray light formed at the edge of the eastern sea. It did not wake the sleepers. It simply revealed what darkness had hidden: beads of dew along the ropes, folded sails upon the yards, and the smooth path left by the tide on the beach. The island's trees emerged layer by layer. First came the ridge, then the palms, then the pale line of the shore. A bird called once from the forest and fell quiet again. The watch changed. Fresh sailors came on deck wrapped in coats against the cooler air. They received the night's report, checked the anchor, and looked toward the hill that held the cave. Soon the cook would light the galley fire. Soon boats, rope, and strong backs would bring the chest down to the waiting ship. There would be counting, careful entries, and talk of the course home. But none of that needed to begin yet. For a few more minutes, the world remained balanced between sleep and morning. Sunlight reached the highest mast first. It touched the damp wood with a narrow line of gold, then descended toward the deck. In the captain's cabin, the silver coin caught that light and glowed upon the chart table beside the old map. Teach continued to sleep, his journey complete for the night. Beyond the stern windows, the bay shone pale turquoise, and the island kept its final shadows among the trees. Far away, or perhaps only within the quiet space where every good story ends, Midnight Cat still sits above the moonlit shore. He has listened to the storm fade, watched the fog close around the ships, and followed the lanterns into the heart of the island. Now the crescent on his forehead grows faint with the coming dawn. He gives one last gentle smile, as though reminding us that history preserves names and dates, while the night preserves legends. Below him, the sea continues its patient breathing. The ship rests at anchor. The treasure is safe beneath the white stone. And, as the first warm light spreads across the water, the tale drifts quietly away, leaving only the soft rhythm of the waves and the deep, untroubled calm of morning.